May 5, 1944, Fort Kearny, Nebraska. The night air hung heavy with spring humidity as Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington paced the wooden floors of his family quarters. The distant sounds of the prisoner of war camp carried on the breeze through open windows. His 4-year-old twin daughters had not slept through the night in 6 months, not since their mother had left for nursing duty in England. The exhausted officer believed his greatest challenge in this war would be organizing the German prisoners who arrived weekly by train. Little did he know that his salvation would come from among their ranks, and in a way no American military man could have possibly foreseen. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how wartime necessity forced desperate enemies to see beyond propaganda and discover that the foundations of human connection, compassion, empathy, and unexpected kindness could flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances of a world divided by the greatest conflict in human history. The Fort Kearny POW camp had been established in 1943 as one of the 425 prisoner of war camps spread across the United States. These facilities housed nearly 400,000 captured Axis troops throughout the war years. Unlike the brutal conditions in many European and Pacific theaters, American POW camps strictly followed Geneva Convention guidelines, providing adequate food, medical care, and even work opportunities for their captives. This adherence to international law would create the conditions for one of the war's most unusual and heartwarming encounters. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington had been assigned to Fort Kearny after suffering a shrapnel wound during the Sicily campaign. His injury had left him with a pronounced limp and deemed unfit for frontline service, but his organizational skills and fluency in German made him an ideal candidate for POW camp administration. His wife, Captain Eleanor Harrington, a surgical nurse with exceptional qualifications, had been deployed to a field hospital in England, preparing for what would eventually be the Normandy invasion. Their twin daughters, Emily and Elizabeth, had always been challenging sleepers, but their mother had developed a special routine that worked reliably. With Eleanor gone, however, the twins had become increasingly difficult to manage. Their nighttime crying echoed through the officers' quarters, and Colonel Harrington grew more exhausted with each passing week. The base physician had tried various remedies, but nothing seemed to help. Sergeant Walter Thompson, the colonel's aide, observed his commanding officer's deteriorating condition with growing concern. "Sir, with respect, you look terrible," Thompson said one morning as he delivered the daily prisoner transfer paperwork. "Have the girls improved at all?" Harrington rubbed his bloodshot eyes. "Not one bit, Thompson. Last night was particularly bad. Elizabeth was up at midnight, then Emily at 2, then both again at 4. I have not had more than 2 consecutive hours of sleep in months. Have you considered hiring help, sir? Perhaps one of the local women? We have tried 3 different sitters. None could manage the twins for more than a week." Harrington sighed heavily. Eleanor had a special touch. She would sing to them old German lullabies her grandmother taught her. "And nothing I do seems to work." Thompson nodded sympathetically. "Well, sir, there is a new prisoner transfer arriving today. 37 Germans captured in North Africa. The paperwork indicates most are Wehrmacht, but there are 3 women among them, nurses from the Afrika Korps field hospitals." Harrington barely registered this information as he shuffled through the stack of transfer forms. Female POWs were uncommon but not unheard of. The military nurses captured alongside male troops were typically housed in separate facilities within the larger camps, given work assignments in camp hospitals or kitchens, and generally caused few disciplinary problems. "Thank you, Thompson. Have Captain Reynolds handle the intake processing today. I need to review these agricultural work assignments for the Department of Agriculture requests." The sergeant hesitated at the door. "Sir, forgive me for speaking out of turn, but if you do not find a solution soon, you might end up in the camp hospital yourself." Harrington waved him away, too tired to reprimand the impertinence. The new prisoner transport arrived just after noon. Fort Kearny already housed over 1,000 German POWs, primarily enlisted men captured in North Africa and Italy. They were housed in converted barracks, surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire, with guard towers at regular intervals. Despite these security measures, the atmosphere at the camp was remarkably relaxed. Many prisoners worked on local farms, addressing the severe labor shortage created by American men serving overseas. Captain Benjamin Reynolds supervised the new arrivals processing with efficient detachment. The prisoners descended from the transport trucks, dusty and exhausted from their long journey. Most were young men in their 20s, their once proud uniforms now faded and stained. Among them were the 3 women, still wearing the grey uniforms of the German military nursing service. The tallest of the 3 women stood out immediately. Her name was Margarete Weber, 31 years old, according to her documentation. She had served as head nurse at a field hospital near Tobruk until its capture by British forces. Her posture remained military straight, despite obvious fatigue, and she kept a watchful eye on her 2 younger colleagues. The camp's chief medical officer, Major Howard Phillips, reviewed the newcomers' medical files. "Nurse Weber," he noted, reading from her intake form, "it says here you specialized in pediatric care before the war." "Yes," she replied in accented but clear English. "I worked 6 years at Charité Hospital in Berlin, children's ward." Phillips made a notation on her file. "You'll be assigned to our camp hospital after processing. We can use someone with your experience." Margareta nodded without emotion, her blue eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts. The 3 women were escorted to their quarters, in a small section of a building separated from the main camp by an additional fence. The American military had initially been unsure how to handle female prisoners, but practicality had prevailed. They were given the same rights and responsibilities as male POWs, with modifications for privacy and appropriate work assignments. As the newcomers settled in, the established routine of the camp continued. German prisoners operated their own internal hierarchy, generally maintaining discipline within their ranks. Many had already accepted their situation, grateful to be alive and treated humanely, thousands of miles from the dangers of the front lines. That night, as Lieutenant Colonel Harrington once again attempted to soothe his crying daughters, a profound storm rolled across the Nebraska plains. Thunder rattled the windows of his quarters, and the twins' crying intensified with each lightning flash. "Please, girls," he pleaded, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Daddy needs you to sleep." 4-year-old Emily, the more verbal of the twins, looked at him with tear-filled eyes. "Want Mommy's songs?" Elizabeth, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, echoed, "Mommy songs, the moon ones." Harrington had tried singing the lullabies his wife had taught him, but his pronunciation of the German lyrics was poor, and his deep voice lacked Eleanor's gentle melody. He tried once more, stumbling through the words of Der Mond ist aufgegangen, an old German folk song about the moon rising. The twins only cried harder. By morning, Harrington's appearance had deteriorated further. Dark circles underlined his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the daily reports. Sergeant Thompson exchanged worried glances with the colonel's secretary, neither knowing how to help their commanding officer. The daily routine at Fort Kearny proceeded with military precision, despite the commander's personal struggles. POWs were assigned to various work details, both within the camp and at nearby farms and factories. The German nurses began their duties at the camp hospital, which served both American personnel and prisoners with equal care, another requirement of the Geneva Convention. Major Phillips was impressed with Nurse Weber's efficiency and professionalism. Unlike some prisoners who worked reluctantly, she approached her duties with thorough dedication. By the end of her first week, she had reorganized the medical supply storage system and implemented several improvements to patient care procedures. "Nurse Weber," Phillips commented as they completed evening rounds, "your work has been exemplary. I'm curious, you seem to have accepted your situation here with remarkable equanimity." Margaret checked a patient's chart before responding. "Major, I am a medical professional. These men need care regardless of which uniform they wear. Besides," she added with the faintest smile, "the food here is better than what we had in North Africa for the past 2 years. Phillips laughed. "I suppose that's true. Still, not all your compatriots share your outlook. They will adjust, or they will make themselves miserable. The choice is theirs." She placed the chart back at the foot of the patient's bed. "We are alive. Many are not so fortunate." The major studied her for a moment. "You're a practical woman, Nurse Weber. In war, practicality is sometimes all we have left." As June arrived, the situation with Colonel Harrington's daughters reached a critical point. The base physician, concerned about both the children's health and their fathers, had begun discussing the possibility of sending the twins to stay with relatives. Harrington resisted this option, knowing how much Eleanor would want the family to remain together. The colonel's predicament became common knowledge throughout the camp, discussed in hushed tones by the American staff, and even filtering to the German prisoners through the camp grapevine. One evening, as Nurse Weber was completing her shift at the hospital, she overheard two American nurses discussing the situation. "The colonel looks like a walking ghost," one said. "Thompson told me the girls were up 5 times last night." "It's those German lullabies," the other replied. "His wife used to sing them, but he can't get them right, and nothing else works for the twins." Margaret paused in her inventory of medical supplies, her mind turning over this information. She had seen the colonel on his inspection rounds, a tall, prematurely grey man whose exhaustion was evident in every movement. She had also glimpsed his daughters once, when they had visited the administrative building with their nanny, 2 identical little girls with dark curls and solemn expressions. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed in the Spartan women's quarters, she found herself humming one of the lullabies her own mother had sung to her as a child. An idea formed in her mind, so unexpected and yet so simple that it stopped her mid-motion. The next morning she approached Major Phillips with a request so unusual that he initially thought he had misunderstood. "You want to what?" he asked, setting down his coffee cup. "I wish to offer my assistance to Colonel Harrington with his daughters," Margaret repeated calmly. "I am trained in pediatric care, and I know the German lullabies his wife would sing." Phillips stared at her. "You're a prisoner of war, Nurse Weber." "Yes, and according to the Geneva Convention, prisoners may volunteer for work details outside the camp, provided appropriate security measures are in place." She maintained steady eye contact. "I am offering my professional services. The colonel's children need help that I can provide." "This is highly irregular," Phillips muttered. "We live in irregular times, Major." After a moment's consideration, Phillips shook his head. "I cannot authorize this. You would need to speak with Colonel Harrington himself, and I doubt he would consider it. Then please arrange for me to speak with him. What harm could come from a conversation?" The Major studied her face, searching for hidden motives and finding none. "I'll mention your offer to him. That's all I can promise." True to his word, Phillips raised the subject with Harrington later that day, expecting immediate rejection. To his surprise, the colonel's reaction was one of desperate hope. "One of the German nurses knows these lullabies?" he asked, suddenly alert. "Nurse Weber claims she does. She has offered to help with your daughters, but sir, surely you're not considering this." Harrington's bloodshot eyes took on a determined look. "At this point, Major, I would consider a deal with the devil himself if it meant my children could sleep through the night." Phillips shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, she's an enemy prisoner. She's a pediatric nurse who speaks German and knows the songs my wife would sing. Have her brought to my office tomorrow morning." The meeting between Colonel Harrington and Nurse Weber took place at precisely 900 hours the following day. Sergeant Thompson escorted her to the administration building, where she stood at attention before the colonel's desk, her posture impeccable despite the strangeness of the situation. Harrington studied her carefully. Margaret Weber was tall for a woman, with blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her blue eyes met his without fear or subservience, the eyes of a professional who knew her worth. "Major Phillips tells me you've offered to help with my daughters," Harrington began, his tone neutral. "Yes, Colonel, I understand they have difficulty sleeping and respond to German lullabies. Why would you want to help? We are enemies, after all." Margaret's expression remained composed. "With respect, Colonel, your daughters are not my enemies. They are children who need sleep. I am a pediatric nurse with the training to help them." "And you expect some privilege in return? Better quarters? Extra rations?" "No, Colonel. I expect nothing. Consider it a professional courtesy." After a moment she added, "Though I would not object to access to your library if you have one. The selection in the camp is rather limited." Harrington leaned back in his chair, weighing his options. The idea was preposterous, inviting a German POW into his home to care for his children, and yet his desperation had reached a breaking point. "These songs my wife sang, how can you know them?" German children's songs are fairly universal across our country, Colonel. Der Mond ist aufgegangen, die Blümelein sie schlafen, guten Abend, gute Nacht. These are songs every German mother knows. The mention of the exact lullabies Eleanor had sung tipped the balance in Harrington's mind. "Here is what I propose," he said finally. "You will come to my quarters this evening at 1900 hours under guard. You will demonstrate whether you can settle the children. If successful, we will establish a regular arrangement. If not, we need never discuss this again." "That seems reasonable, Colonel. I need not remind you, Nurse Weber, that any attempt to exploit this situation will result in severe consequences." "Of course, Colonel." Her expression never changed, but something in her eyes, perhaps a flicker of amusement or offense, suggested she found his warning unnecessary. That evening, Margaret was escorted to the officers' quarters by Sergeant Thompson and a military policeman, who would remain outside the house. The Harrington home was modest but comfortable, with simple furniture and photographs on the walls. The twins, Emily and Elizabeth, regarded the stranger with identical expressions of curiosity. They were dressed in matching pajamas, their dark curls framing round faces that showed signs of chronic tiredness. "Girls," Harrington said, kneeling beside them, "this is Nurse Weber. She's going to sing you some songs to help you sleep, like Mommy used to." The twins looked skeptical but didn't protest as Margaret sat in the rocking chair beside their beds. Without preamble, she began to sing Der Mond ist aufgegangen, her voice clear and gentle. The effect on the children was almost immediate. Their eyes widened in recognition, and they settled back against their pillows, attention fixed on the German woman. When she finished the first song, Margaret moved smoothly into Die Blümelein sie schlafen, a lullaby about flowers sleeping under moonlight. Her pronunciation and melody were perfect, bringing to life the songs Eleanor had sung to her daughters since infancy. By the third verse, both girls' eyelids were drooping. Harrington watched in amazement as his daughters, who had fought sleep for months, gradually succumbed to its pull. By the time Margaret finished the third song, both twins were deeply asleep, their breathing even and peaceful. She rose quietly from the chair and followed Harrington from the room. In the small living area, the Colonel stared at her with undisguised wonder. "How did you do that?" "Children respond to familiarity and routine. Colonel, these songs connect them to their mother. They need consistency. Same songs, same voice, same time each night." "Can you come again tomorrow?" The question came out more pleading than he intended. "If you arrange it with the camp authorities, yes." And so began one of the most unusual arrangements in the history of Fort Kearny. Each evening, Nurse Margareta Weber was escorted to Colonel Harrington's quarters, where she sang the twins to sleep. Always the same 3 German lullabies in the same order. Within a week, both girls were sleeping through the night consistently for the first time in 6 months. The transformation in Colonel Harrington was equally dramatic. With proper rest, his efficiency returned, his decision-making sharpened, and the entire camp operation benefited from his improved leadership. Major Phillips expressed his continued reservations about the arrangement. "Sir, while I cannot argue with the results, having a German POW regularly entering the home of the camp commander creates a significant security concern." "She is under guard at all times," Harrington countered. "Even so, sir, there will be talk. Not everyone will understand." Harrington frowned. "The well-being of my children takes precedence over camp gossip, Major. Unless you can provide evidence of actual security risks, the arrangement will continue." Indeed, the unusual situation had become a topic of speculation throughout Fort Kearny. American personnel were divided in their opinions, with some admiring the practical solution and others disapproving of the familiarity between the camp commander and an enemy prisoner. Among the German POWs, reactions ranged from amusement to accusations of collaboration. Nurse Weber's 2 colleagues, Helga Schmidt and Frieda Müller, defended her against criticism from their compatriots. "You should be grateful," Helga told one particularly vocal critic, a former lieutenant named Kurt Wagner. "Her cooperation improves conditions for all of us. The colonel is more reasonable when he's not exhausted." Wagner spat on the ground. "She sings German children to sleep with American lullabies. It's disgusting." "They're German lullabies," Frieda corrected. "And they're children, not soldiers." As summer progressed, an unexpected dynamic developed. The twins, initially cautious around Margaret, grew increasingly attached to her. They began looking forward to her evening visits, rushing to greet her at the door and showing her their toys and drawings. "Nurse Webber, look!" Elizabeth would exclaim, presenting a crayon picture of stick figures and a yellow sun. "Very beautiful," Margaret would respond, her usual reserve softening around the children. "Is this your family?" "Yes, that's Daddy, that's Emily, that's me, that's you, and that's Mommy in the big boat across the water." The inclusion of herself in the family drawing did not escape Margaret's notice, nor Colonel Harrington's. Neither commented on it. By July, the arrangement had expanded slightly. Margaret now arrived earlier in the evenings to help with the twins' bath time and to read them stories before singing them to sleep. She taught them simple German words and phrases, which they absorbed with the remarkable linguistic facility of young children. Harrington, initially maintaining a formal distance, gradually found himself engaging in conversation with Margaret after the children were asleep. Their discussions began with the twins' development, but inevitably expanded to other topics. "Your English is excellent," he remarked one evening as they sat in the living room, waiting for Sergeant Thompson to return and escort her back to the camp. "I studied in London for a year before the war," she explained, "at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. I had planned to specialize in pediatric surgery. And then the war intervened. Yes, I returned to Germany in 1938. By 39, I was in the military nursing service." "Did you believe in it?" Harrington asked suddenly. "The cause?" Margaret considered her response carefully. "I believed in my duty to care for wounded soldiers. As for the politics," she paused. "Colonel, some questions are best left unasked of prisoners who must return to their own country after the war." He nodded, understanding her caution. "Fair enough." In August, a letter arrived from Eleanor Harrington, describing the chaos of the field hospital in the weeks following D-Day. Her unit had moved into France, following the advancing Allied forces. She wrote of her heartache at being separated from her family and asked anxiously about the twins' well-being. Harrington sat at his desk that evening, pen in hand, struggling with how to explain the current arrangement to his wife. How could he tell Eleanor that her daughters were now being cared for by a German POW, that they were learning German phrases and drawing pictures that included Margaret in the family circle, that he himself had come to look forward to their evening conversations? He finally composed a carefully worded letter, explaining that he had found a German-speaking nurse who helped with the children's bedtime routine. He emphasized the improvement in the twins' sleep patterns and health, but omitted specific details about Margaret's status as a prisoner. As summer turned to autumn, the dynamics at Fort Kearny continued to evolve. The success of the agricultural work program had created goodwill between many prisoners and the local farming community. Weekend baseball games between POW teams and local Nebraska teams had become a regular occurrence, drawing spectators from surrounding areas. These developments reflected a broader pattern across America's POW camps. As the war progressed, the rigid boundaries between captors and captives often softened through daily interaction and mutual respect. Many German prisoners, particularly those who had never embraced Nazi ideology, found themselves experiencing an unexpected affinity for American culture and values. For Margareta Weber, this transformation manifested in her growing attachment to the Harrington twins. Each evening, as she sang them to sleep, she felt the weight of her own losses, the career interrupted, the family members whose fates remained unknown, the years stolen by war. The simple routine of bathing, reading to, and singing the girls to sleep provided a pocket of normalcy in the surreal experience of captivity. Colonel Harrington observed these subtle changes in Margaret, how her formal demeanor had gradually softened, how she sometimes continued singing even after the twins had fallen asleep, lost in the melodies of her homeland. He recognized in her eyes the same weariness with war that he felt in his own heart. One evening in late September, as the first autumn chill crept across the plains, their usual post-bedtime conversation took an unexpected turn. "The girls asked me today when their mother will return," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. Harrington sighed. Eleanor's last letter mentioned possibly being home for Christmas, but with the fighting in Europe intensifying, I'm not optimistic. They miss her very much. Yes. He hesitated. They've become quite attached to you as well. Children are adaptable. When their mother returns, they will adjust. And you? What happens to you when the war ends? Margaret looked out the window at the darkening sky. I return to Germany, whatever remains of it. To resume your medical career? Perhaps, if there are hospitals left standing. She turned to face him. What about you, Colonel? What happens when your war ends? The personal nature of the question surprised him. I return to civilian law practice in Connecticut. Resume normal life. Whatever that means after all this. Normal. She gave a small, sad smile. I'm not sure I remember what that is anymore. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sergeant Thompson, right on schedule. As Margaret rose to leave, Harrington found himself wishing for the first time that she could stay longer. October brought dramatic news that transformed the atmosphere at Fort Kearny. The Allied forces were making significant advances across Western Europe, while in the east, Soviet troops pushed toward Germany itself. Each day, radio reports detailed another town liberated, another enemy position overrun. For the American personnel, these developments brought hope for a war's end perhaps sooner than expected. For the German prisoners, they brought a complex mixture of emotions, concern for homeland and family, uncertainty about the future, and for some, relief that the Nazi regime might finally fall. Margaret received her first Red Cross letter since arriving at Fort Kearny, a brief note from her sister in Munich, written months earlier. The news was grim. Their childhood home destroyed in an air raid, their elderly father's health failing, food increasingly scarce. That evening, her songs to the twins carried an undercurrent of melancholy that even the children seemed to sense. 4-year-old Emily placed her small hand on Margaret's cheek as she sang. "Don't be sad, Nurse Weber," she said with a child's directness. "Daddy says the war will be over soon and everybody can go home." Margaret gently tucked the blanket around the little girl. "That's right, Liebling. Everyone will go home." Later, when the children were asleep, Harrington noticed her unusual quietness. "Bad news from home?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. In a gesture that would have been unthinkable months earlier, he poured 2 glasses of whiskey and offered one to her. "To better days ahead," he said quietly. She accepted both the drink and the sentiment, though neither fully believed those days would come soon. As the evening temperatures dropped, Harrington noticed Margaret's standard-issue POW jacket was inadequate against the Nebraska autumn. Without mentioning it to her, he arranged for a warmer coat to be provided, citing medical necessity for a nurse working evening shifts. Major Phillips raised an eyebrow at the requisition but approved it without comment. The changing dynamics between the colonel and Nurse Weber had not escaped his notice, nor that of others at Fort Kearny. While nothing improper had occurred, the growing familiarity between them existed in a grey area not covered by military regulations. November brought the first snowfall and news of Eleanor Harrington's imminent return. Her field hospital unit was being rotated back to England, and she had secured transport to the United States, expecting to arrive before Christmas. Harrington shared this news with the twins, who responded with excited bouncing and questions about presents. He then faced the more difficult task of explaining it to Margaret. "My wife will be home in approximately 3 weeks," he said that evening, after the children were asleep. "That is wonderful news, Colonel. Your daughters will be overjoyed." "Yes." He paused, uncertain how to continue. "This arrangement, your evening visits, will need to end before her arrival." "Of course." Her expression remained composed. "The children sleep well now. They should transition easily back to their mother's care." The practical, professional response was exactly what he should have wanted, yet he found himself oddly disappointed by it. "I've arranged for you to receive a commendation in your military file," he continued. "Your assistance has been invaluable." "Thank you, Colonel. That's unnecessary, but appreciated." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken acknowledgments of how far beyond a simple professional arrangement their interaction had evolved. "The children will miss you," he finally said, "and I them." She met his eyes directly. They are remarkable little girls. You and your wife should be very proud." The following weeks took on the quality of an anticipated farewell. Each evening, Margaret seemed to commit every detail of the twins to memory. The precise shade of their dark curls, the gap in Elizabeth's front teeth, the way Emily twisted her fingers when concentrating on a story. The children, intuiting that a change approached, became increasingly affectionate with her, demanding extra stories and songs, creating drawings and small gifts for her to keep. "This is for you," Emily announced one evening, presenting Margaret with a clumsily folded paper star. "Daddy helped me make it. It's for your Christmas tree." Margaret accepted it solemnly. "Thank you, Emily. It's beautiful." "Do you have a Christmas tree in Germany?" Elizabeth asked. "Yes, Liebling, the Tannenbaum tradition began in Germany, you know. We put real candles on our trees very carefully. When you go back to Germany, will you put my star on your tree?" The innocent question caught Margaret off guard. "Yes," she promised, her voice barely steady. "Every year." December 7th brought unexpected drama to Fort Kearney. A group of 3 prisoners, hardline Nazi supporters, who had been troublemakers since their arrival, attempted an escape during a work detail. They overpowered their guard, stole his weapon, and fled into the countryside. The incident triggered emergency protocols throughout the camp. All prisoners were confined to their quarters for a head count, while search parties were dispatched to locate the escapees. Colonel Harrington, coordinating the response from the command center, was forced to cancel Margaret's evening visit. The twins, already in their pajamas and expecting her arrival, reacted with tearful disappointment. "But Nurse Weber always comes," Elizabeth wailed. "She has to sing the moon song." "Not tonight, sweetheart," Harrington explained, distracted by the crisis. "Nurse Weber has to stay at the hospital tonight. She promised to finish our story." Emily joined the protest. "I'm sorry, girls. It's just not possible tonight." Left with the twins' nanny, who lacked both Margaret's songs and her quiet authority, the girls refused to sleep. Their cries could be heard in the background as Harrington received updates by telephone throughout the evening. The escapees were captured before midnight, cold and disoriented in the unfamiliar landscape. As they were returned to camp and placed in the stockade, Harrington finally returned home to find both twins still awake, red-eyed and miserable. "Daddy," Emily asked as he checked on them, "is Nurse Weber in trouble?" "No, sweetheart." "Why would you think that?" "Because she didn't come, like when I'm in trouble and can't have dessert." Harrington sat on the edge of her bed. "Nurse Weber isn't in trouble. There was a problem at the camp and everyone had to stay in their own beds tonight." "Will she come tomorrow?" "Yes, she'll be here tomorrow." He smoothed her hair. "Now try to sleep. It's very late." The twins finally fell asleep in the early morning hours, leaving Harrington with barely enough time to change his uniform before returning to duty. The escape attempt had created mountains of paperwork and required a full security review of all camp procedures. That evening, when Margaret arrived under escort, the twins rushed to her with unusual fervor, clinging to her hands and talking over each other about their disrupted night. "We couldn't sleep without your songs," Elizabeth explained earnestly. "Daddy tried to sing them, but he did it wrong," added Emily. "Did he?" Margaret caught Harrington's eye over their heads, a hint of amusement in her expression. "Well, I'm here now, and we'll make sure tonight is better." The bedtime routine proceeded with heightened intensity, as if the previous night's interruption had reminded everyone of its impermanence. Margaret sang all their favorite lullabies, adding extra verses she rarely included. The twins, perhaps sensing something in her manner, were reluctant to let sleep claim them, fighting to keep their eyes open until exhaustion finally won. When she emerged from their bedroom, Harrington was waiting in the living room, his expression troubled. "I received word today that my wife's transport has been delayed," he said without preamble. "She won't arrive until after Christmas." "I'm sorry to hear that. The children will be disappointed." "Yes," he hesitated. "There's something else. After yesterday's incident, Major Phillips and I have reviewed security protocols. He feels, and regulations support him, that your evening visits here represent an unacceptable risk." Margaret's face remained impassive, but her posture stiffened slightly. "I understand, Colonel." The girls have become too dependent on you, he continued, as if needing to justify the decision. It's not healthy for them or fair to my wife. When would you like the arrangement to end? Major Phillips recommends immediately, but given the holidays and my wife's delay. He met her eyes. I've authorized continuation until December 23rd. That gives us time to prepare the twins for the transition. Very well, Colonel. I appreciate the notice. Her formal tone matched his own, creating an artificial distance that neither acknowledged, but both felt acutely. The following days took on a bittersweet quality. Margaret began gradually modifying her routine with the twins, teaching them to sing along with the lullabies themselves, explaining that soon they would need to help their daddy remember the words properly. "Will you come back to visit us after Christmas?" Elizabeth asked one night. Margaret exchanged a quick glance with Harrington before answering, "I don't think so, Liebling. Your mother will be home then and she'll want to sing to you herself." "But we like when you sing to us," Emily protested. "And I love singing to you," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "But sometimes we must say goodbye to people we care about." "Because of the war?" Elizabeth asked. "Yes, because of the war." "I don't like the war," Emily declared with 4-year-old conviction. "It's stupid." "Out of the mouths of babes," Harrington murmured from the doorway. The December weather turned brutally cold, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and snow blanketing the camp. Concerns about adequate heating in the prisoner barracks led to temporary relocation of some POWs to buildings with better insulation. Margaret and her 2 nursing colleagues were moved to a small room adjacent to the camp hospital, where they could assist with an influx of respiratory cases while benefiting from the building's superior heating system. The harsh conditions created additional complications for the bedtime routine. One evening, a blizzard made it impossible for Margaret to safely cross from the hospital to the officers' quarters, resulting in another difficult night for the twins. The following evening, determined to prevent a repeat scenario, Harrington made an unprecedented decision. He brought the twins to the camp hospital, bundled in warm coats and scarves for their bedtime routine. Major Phillips was apoplectic when he discovered this breach of protocol. "Colonel, with all due respect, bringing your children into a secure military facility to visit a POW is completely unauthorized." "They were never unescorted, Major. I was with them the entire time." "That's hardly the point, sir. This has gone beyond reasonable accommodation. I must formally object to this arrangement continuing in any form." Harrington knew Phillips was right. The situation had evolved far beyond its original parameters, crossing lines that his military training told him should never be crossed. Yet watching his daughters peacefully sleeping after Margaretta's songs, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decisions. "Your objection is noted, Major. The arrangement ends on December 23rd as planned." December 22nd, the penultimate evening of Margaret's visits, brought clear, cold weather and a somber mood to the Harrington household. The twins, now fully aware that this routine was ending, had been unusually subdued throughout the day. Margaret arrived with a small package wrapped in plain brown paper, something she had never done before. "A Christmas gift for the girls," she explained, when Harrington raised an eyebrow. "With your permission, of course," he nodded. "They have something for you as well." The bedtime routine took longer than usual that night. The twins insisted on extra stories and repeated songs, employing every childhood delay tactic with surprising sophistication for 4-year-olds. Finally, when they could fight sleep no longer, Margaret sang the last verses of Guten Abend, Gute Nacht. As their eyes closed, she placed a gentle hand on each dark head. "Schlaft gut, meine Lieblinge," she whispered. "Sleep well, my darlings." In the living room, the twins' clumsily wrapped gift waited on the coffee table. Margaret opened it to find a small photograph in a homemade frame decorated with painted macaroni. The picture showed her sitting in the rocking chair with a twin on each side, all 3 smiling at the camera, a moment Harrington had captured weeks earlier without her knowledge. "They wanted you to have something to remember them by," he explained. Margaret studied the photograph, her composure finally cracking slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This means more than I can express." "Your gift?" he prompted after a moment. "Oh, yes." She handed him the package. "It's nothing elaborate. Materials are limited, as you know." Inside was a hand-sewn book, its pages made from hospital supply paper, carefully bound with thread. Each page featured illustrated lyrics to one of the German lullabies she had sung to the twins, the words written in both German and English, with simple drawings decorating the margins. "I thought it might help," she explained, "after I'm gone." The proper pronunciations are noted beneath each line. Harrington turned the pages slowly, recognizing the hours of work the gift represented. "This is—" He searched for adequate words. "This is above and beyond any duty, Nurse Weber." "It was not done out of duty, Colonel." Their eyes met briefly, acknowledging what neither would say aloud. December 23rd arrived with fresh snow and holiday preparations throughout Fort Kearny. The camp's German POWs, following their own traditions, had created elaborate decorations for their quarters and planned Christmas performances featuring traditional songs and plays. For the final bedtime visit, Harrington had allowed the twins to stay up later than usual. They had decorated a small Christmas tree in the corner of the living room and prepared hot chocolate for everyone. When Margaret arrived, Emily and Elizabeth presented her with paper chains they had made that day. "For your Christmas tree," Emily explained. "Because real candles are dangerous," added Elizabeth. Margaret accepted the decorations with appropriate solemnity. "They're beautiful, thank you." The evening proceeded with a strained cheerfulness, everyone aware of its significance, but trying to maintain normalcy for the children's sake. The usual stories and songs were extended, special requests honored, extra hugs exchanged. When it was finally time for the last lullaby, Margaret sat in the rocking chair with a twin on each knee, an arrangement they had outgrown months ago but insisted upon for this final night. She sang Der Mond ist aufgegangen one last time, her clear voice filling the small bedroom with the familiar melody about the rising moon, golden stars, and the silence of the forest. The twins, fighting sleep with determined concentration, finally succumbed just before she reached the last verse. Margaret continued singing, completing the lullaby as tears she had refused to acknowledge slipped silently down her cheeks. She tucked each girl into bed with special care, straightening their blankets and brushing curls from their foreheads. At the doorway, she paused for a long moment, committing the scene to memory. The peaceful faces of the children, the soft glow of the nightlight, the small stuffed animals standing guard beside each pillow. In the living room, Harrington waited with 2 glasses of whiskey, a farewell ritual they had established over the past weeks. "I want to thank you," he began, handing her a glass, "for everything you've done for my daughters, for my family." "It has been my privilege, Colonel." She accepted the drink but didn't sip it yet. "Your daughters are remarkable children. They help me remember that there is goodness in this world beyond the war." "What will you do when you return to Germany?" "Rebuild, if there's anything left to rebuild. Continue my medical work. Children will need care more than ever." "The war can't last much longer," he said, echoing a sentiment expressed with increasing frequency across America. "No." Her expression darkened slightly. "But the aftermath may be worse in its own way." They drank in silence for a moment, each lost in thoughts of a future that seemed simultaneously too close and impossibly distant. "I have something for you," Harrington said suddenly, reaching into his pocket. "It isn't much, regulations limit what I can give to a prisoner, but I wanted you to have this." He handed her a small box containing a silver pin in the shape of a crescent moon, simple but elegantly crafted. "To remember the lullabies," he explained, "and the children." Margaret held the pin carefully, as if it might dissolve at her touch. "Thank you, Colonel. I will treasure it." "James," he said quietly. "My name is James." Her eyes met his, acknowledging the significance of this final dropping of formality. "Margaret," she responded, though he had never used her rank or surname anyway. The moment was interrupted by the punctual knock of Sergeant Thompson at the door. Their time had expired. Their farewell was brief and proper, witnessed by Thompson and constrained by their respective positions, a German prisoner and an American officer, saying goodbye after an arrangement that had benefited both but could not continue. "Goodbye, Colonel Harrington. Thank you for trusting me with your children. Goodbye, Nurse Weber, and thank you." She walked away between her escorts, back straight, head high, not looking back at the house or the man standing in its doorway. Christmas at Fort Kearny brought the usual military observances, special meals, limited decorations, services for those who wished to attend. The German prisoners celebrated according to their own traditions, with the camp authorities allowing certain accommodations in the spirit of the Geneva Convention. For Colonel Harrington and his daughters, the holiday was quieter than anticipated. The twins asked for Margaret repeatedly on Christmas Eve, needing to be reminded that she wouldn't be coming anymore. They hung their stockings and left cookies for Santa with subdued enthusiasm. On Christmas morning, among the presents under their small tree, the girls found a package containing 2 identical rag dolls dressed in miniature nurses' uniforms with tiny red cross armbands. There was no card, but the careful stitching and attention to detail made the source unmistakable. "Look, Daddy!" Elizabeth exclaimed. "Nurse Weber sent us dolls." Harrington examined the gifts with surprise. He had not authorized any delivery from the POW camp, which meant someone, likely Sergeant Thompson, had bent regulations to allow this final gesture from Margaret to the twins. "They're beautiful," he said, watching his daughters clutch the dolls with delight. "You must take very good care of them." Later that day, he quietly arranged for a package to be delivered to the women's quarters at the camp. Extra rations of coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes, items that served as currency among the prisoners and could make their confinement more comfortable. The package was addressed to all 3 German nurses, maintaining the fiction that it was not specifically intended for Margaret. 2 days after Christmas, a telegram arrived announcing Eleanor Harrington's imminent return. Her transport had reached New York, and she would arrive at Fort Kearny on December 29th. The news sent the household into a flurry of preparation. The twins, excited but nervous about the mother they barely remembered, asked endless questions about what she would be like, whether she would know the same songs as Nurse Weber, whether she would like their new dolls. On the morning of Eleanor's arrival, Harrington and the twins waited at the small train station that served Fort Kearny and the surrounding area. The girls wore their best dresses, their dark curls tamed into identical ribboned styles, bouncing with anticipation on the platform. When the train pulled in, amid the steam and noise of the locomotive, a slender woman in a captain's uniform descended from the passenger car. Eleanor Harrington had lost weight during her overseas service, and new lines of experience marked her face. But her smile remained as bright as in the photographs that had kept her memory alive for her daughters. The reunion was emotional and chaotic, with the twins initially shy but quickly warming to their mother's embraces and exclamations over how they had grown. Eleanor's eyes, meeting her husband's over the children's heads, conveyed volumes about the toll their separation had taken on her as well. Back at their quarters, as Eleanor unpacked and the twins showed off their toys and drawings, the subject of Nurse Weber inevitably arose. "And this is Greta," Emily explained, showing her mother the rag doll. "Nurse Weber made her for Christmas." Eleanor glanced at her husband questioningly. "Nurse Weber is the German-speaking nurse I mentioned in my letters," Harrington explained. "She helped with the girls' bedtime routine." "She sang us the moon song and the flower song," Elizabeth added, "and she taught us German words." "Did she?" Eleanor's tone remained light, but her expression had grown curious. "It sounds like you became quite fond of her." "We love Nurse Weber," Emily stated matter-of-factly. "She had to go away because of the stupid war, but Daddy says maybe someday when there's no more war, she can visit us again." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly at this, but she maintained her smile. "Well, I'm very grateful to her for taking such good care of you while I was gone." Later, when the twins were napping, exhausted from the excitement, Eleanor and James sat together in the living room, reconnecting after their long separation. "This Nurse Weber," Eleanor began carefully. "The girls seem quite attached to her." Harrington sighed, knowing this conversation had been inevitable. "She was a godsend, Eleanor. The girls weren't sleeping. Nothing I tried worked, and she knew the German lullabies you used to sing. And she's a prisoner of war, one of the German nurses at the camp hospital. Yes, it started as a desperate measure and evolved into a regular arrangement." He met his wife's eyes directly. "I did what I thought best for the girls." Eleanor was silent for a moment, processing this information. "James, I'm not angry. I'm just trying to understand. It seems unusual. It was, completely unprecedented, as Phillips reminded me daily. He smiled slightly. But it worked. The girls slept, I could function again, and Nurse Weber, Margaret, was unfailingly professional throughout. Eleanor noted the use of the first name but didn't comment on it. Instead, she asked, "Will the girls be able to see her again, to say a proper goodbye? They clearly care for her." The question surprised him. "You wouldn't mind?" "James, I've spent 2 years in field hospitals watching young men die thousands of miles from home. If this war has taught me anything, it's that human connections matter more than national boundaries." She reached for his hand. "Besides, I owe this woman a debt of gratitude for caring for my children when I couldn't be here." 2 days later, a special visit was arranged. The Harrington family, James, Eleanor, and the twins, came to the camp hospital on the pretext of a routine inspection. In the small office adjoining the ward, they found Margaret cataloguing medical supplies. Her surprise at seeing the twins was genuine, as was her instinctive smile when they rushed toward her with excited greetings. The smile faltered slightly when she noticed Eleanor standing behind them, watching the interaction with thoughtful eyes. "Nurse Weber," Harrington said formally, "may I present my wife, Captain Eleanor Harrington?" Margaret straightened to attention. "Captain Harrington, it's an honor to meet you." Eleanor stepped forward, extending her hand in a gesture that crossed military protocols but felt right in the moment. "The honor is mine, Nurse Weber. I understand you've been taking excellent care of my family in my absence." Margaret accepted the handshake with momentary hesitation. "Your daughters are wonderful children, Captain. It was a privilege to assist them." "We brought you something," Elizabeth interrupted, tugging at Margaret's hand. "To say thank you." Emily presented a package wrapped in Christmas paper, a family photograph in a proper frame, all 4 Harringtons posed in their living room. "So you won't forget us," she explained earnestly. "As if I could ever forget you," Margaret replied, her composure slipping for just a moment. While the twins chatted excitedly, telling Margaret about their Christmas and their mother's return, Eleanor drew her husband slightly aside. "She's not what I expected," she murmured. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure. Not someone so—" She searched for the right word. "Human, I suppose." Harrington nodded, understanding completely. "That's the lesson of this war, isn't it? The humanity we share despite everything." The visit lasted only 15 minutes, all that could be justified under military protocols. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor surprised everyone by addressing Margaret directly. "Nurse Weber, would you teach me the lullabies? The correct pronunciation, I mean. I learned them from my grandmother, but I fear my German has suffered over the years." Margaret's expression registered surprise, then understanding. "Of course, Captain, if Colonel Harrington can arrange it." "I'll see to it," he confirmed. The farewell was easier this time, with promises of another visit before any transfer could remove Margaret from Fort Kearny. The twins hugged her tightly, no longer afraid of separation now that they had experienced reunion. As winter turned to spring, the war in Europe reached its final stages. News of Allied advances dominated the radio broadcasts, and the mood among the German prisoners shifted from resignation to concern about what awaited them in a defeated homeland. The Harrington family had settled into a new routine. Eleanor, having learned the proper pronunciation of the German lullabies from Margaret during several authorized visits, now sang the twins to sleep herself each night. The girls, delighted to have their mother home, had gradually stopped asking about Nurse Weber with the resilience of children. In April, as news of the German collapse filled the airwaves, Colonel Harrington received orders that would affect the Fort Kearny POW population. With the European war clearly ending, preparations were beginning for the eventual repatriation of prisoners. The first step would involve consolidating POWs in larger facilities near coastal ports, ready for transport once conditions allowed. The Fort Kearny contingent was scheduled for transfer to Camp Shanks, New York, in early May, the first step in their long journey home. Margaret and her fellow German nurses would be among the first group to leave. Harrington debated whether to tell the twins about the transfer, concerned about reopening emotional attachments that had begun to heal. Eleanor, however, was firm in her opinion. They should have the chance to say goodbye properly, she insisted. They're young, but they understand more than we give them credit for. And so, on a warm spring afternoon, the Harrington family made one final visit to the camp hospital. The twins, now nearly 5 years old, had brought drawings and small treasures to give Margaret: a pressed flower, a pretty stone found in the garden, a paper airplane James had taught them to fold. Margaret received these gifts with appropriate gravity, storing them carefully in the small suitcase that contained her few possessions. In return, she gave each girl a simple cloth bookmark, embroidered with their initial, made during her evening hours in the women's quarters. "To remember me when you read your stories," she explained. The farewell was brief but meaningful, without the constraint of their earlier separation. Eleanor, watching her daughters interact with the German woman who had cared for them during her absence, felt a complex mixture of gratitude and a mother's instinctive protectiveness. When it was time to leave, Eleanor stepped forward impulsively. "Thank you," she said quietly to Margaret. "Not just for the children, but for James as well. He couldn't have managed without you." Margaret nodded, unable to formulate an adequate response. The two women regarded each other for a moment. Two professionals, two patriots, two people caught in the machinery of a war neither had created, but both had served. "If circumstances were different," Eleanor added, "I think we might have been friends." "Perhaps someday," Margaret replied, "when the world makes more sense than it does now." The transfer convoy departed Fort Kearny on May 2, 1945. Coincidentally, the same day Berlin fell to Soviet forces. The German POWs, including Margarete Weber, began their journey eastward toward temporary holding facilities and eventually back to a homeland transformed by defeat and occupation. Colonel Harrington stood at attention as the trucks passed through the main gate, maintaining military protocol to the end. If his eyes sought out a particular face among the departing prisoners, no one remarked upon it. The Harrington family remained at Fort Kearny until 1946, when James received his discharge and they returned to civilian life in Connecticut. The twins started school, grew up, and eventually had children of their own. Eleanor resumed her nursing career, specializing in pediatrics. James returned to his law practice, focusing on international law and eventually working on reconstruction programs for war-torn Europe. The hand-sewn book of lullabies remained on the twins' bookshelf throughout their childhood, used first by their mother and later by the girls themselves as they learned to read. The silver moon pin traveled back to Germany with Margarete Weber, who survived the difficult post-war years and eventually re-established her medical career, specializing in treating children traumatized by the war. In 1961, 16 years after the end of World War II, Dr. Margarete Weber received an unexpected package from the United States. Inside was a wedding invitation for Elizabeth Harrington, along with a brief note from James and Eleanor explaining that both twins had specifically requested her presence if it could be arranged. Despite the logistical challenges of Cold War travel restrictions, Margaret made the journey to Connecticut for the wedding. There, in a sunlit garden filled with flowers, she was reunited with the Harrington family. James with silver at his temples, Eleanor elegant in mother-of-the-bride attire, and the twins, now beautiful young women of 21, tall and poised, but with the same dark curls and bright eyes she remembered. During the reception, as the orchestra played and guests danced on the lawn, Emily found a moment alone with Margaret. "I still have Greta," she said, referring to the rag doll from that long-ago Christmas. "She's a bit worn now, but I've kept her all these years." "I still have your photograph," Margaret replied, "and every Christmas I put the paper star on my tree just as I promised." Emily smiled. "You know, I don't remember much about the war, or even about Fort Kearny, but I remember your songs. Mum sang them to us for years afterward, but it was never quite the same as when you sang them. Your mother is a remarkable woman. I always admired her generosity of spirit." "She says the same about you," Emily hesitated, then added, "Dad does too." Across the garden, James Harrington watched the conversation between his daughter and the woman who had once been POW Nurse Weber. Their eyes met briefly over the crowd, acknowledging the extraordinary journey that had brought them from opposite sides of a world conflict to this peaceful Connecticut garden. That night, as the wedding festivities wound down and guests departed, the Harrington family and Margaret found themselves alone on the porch of the family home. Eleanor, practical as always, brought out glasses and a bottle of whiskey, an echo of those evening conversations in Nebraska 16 years earlier. "To peace," James proposed, raising his glass, "and to connections that transcend conflict." "To the twins," Eleanor added, "and their future happiness." "To lullabies," Margaret said softly, "and the children who remember them." They drank together as the summer stars emerged above, each reflecting on the strange, winding path that had brought them to this moment, a path that began in the desperate days of global war and culminated in this intimate gathering of people who had once been enemies but had found their way to something that, against all odds, resembled friendship. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.